This episode of Do You Want to Hear a Story is intended for adult audiences. It may contain graphic descriptions and coarse language. Listener discretion is advised. How does $15 million for 11 minutes work sound? On what seemed to be just any other Wednesday, Ray Bennett and his highly trained team of criminals would go on to steal millions of dollars from the bookies at the Victoria Club. Do you want to hear a story?
Will you give a few seconds of your time?
Good evening, folks.
Kennedy can die.
The atomic power plant in the city of Kiev was damaged.
How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history?
69.
The energy crisis.
Who were gathered at St. Peter's Square in the Vatican today.
You want to hear my story?
Tonight, an Australia-wide hunt is continuing for the Victoria Club bandits, so far without success. Official estimates still put the haul at $1.5 million, but there are many in Melbourne who now say the figure could be as high as $5 million. We'll be crossing to Melbourne shortly for the latest on today's investigations, but first, we look at connections interstate. Jim Whaley reports.
There seems little doubt tonight that associates in Sydney or Brisbane were in on the job. I understand that at least 5 other men were involved in this copybook robbery. One police officer, in the midst of inquiries in Sydney, told me today that some of the culprits could have left the country already, probably to Noumea or Fiji. Breakthroughs in the case from this end will not come quickly. Police will be relying mostly on informants and a lot of footwork.
Raymond Bennett, or Ray Chuck, or just Chuck as he was known, is considered to be one of Australia's most intelligent criminals, quickly donning the moniker of a criminal mastermind. Are you familiar with Ray Bennett? I know I asked that at the beginning of every story I tell, but he was in a lot of the Underbelly series, if you ever watched those.
So I can't say that I'm that familiar with Ray Bennett because my Underbelly watching stopped halfway through the second season.
Fair enough. I think he appeared in some of the later ones because this all took place around the 70s.
Right.
So before I can tell you about the largest cash robberies in Australia's history, depending on who you speak to, I have to tell you about Ray Bennett. So the history books would say Ray Bennett, bank robber, criminal mastermind, organizer of the great Bookie Heist, and murderer. He was a huge criminal figure. He planned and pulled off the greatest heist in Australia's history, netting him and his crew over $15 million in the 70s. Despite his charm, he was a vicious criminal and a killer. He and his various crews were known to terrorize innocents across not just Australia, but Europe as well. In the criminal circles of Melbourne, Ray was looked at as somewhat of a cult icon of crime. He was known as the guy who could pull off the jobs that others deemed to be impossible. It was well known that his jobs were always meticulously planned with specific training for everyone involved and executed with military-like precision. So growing up in Melbourne's outer west, he was known even at a young age to be a petty crim. At just 14, he was already involved with the Melbourne's painters and dockers, who during the 60s and 70s were at the top, if not the entire Melbourne underworld.
I know of the painters and dockers, and only because the movie Chopper with Eric Bana,
Yep.
they are referenced, and that movie is now 20 years old. So obviously when I hear about something like that, I do a bit of research, and I found out a bit about the painters and dockers. So yes, that's definitely something I'm familiar with.
Yeah. So on paper, the painters and dockers, it was a union for dock workers. And by definition, I mean, they were responsible for painting ships and unloading the boats as they'd come into the docks.
Which is where most crime happens.
Right. And the reality of the painters and dockers were, I guess, like I said, they were at the top of the Melbourne crime underworld. If not, they made up at least 90% of it. If something big was happening in Melbourne whilst the painters and dockers were around,
They were involved.
It's hard to imagine that they weren't involved. And if you tried to do something and you didn't involve them, it was only gonna lead to trouble for you.
Yeah, exactly.
So a lot of the things that they were known for was everything from a basic level, shoplifting, armed robberies, extortion rackets, up to drug dealing, hijackings, and even murder. Constant internal disputes with the painters and dockers meant that, I use this term loosely, management was often changing. It was a well-known fact that whoever ran the painters and dockers basically ran the Melbourne underworld.
Right.
So we've still got a lot of unions these days. I just don't think they're anything like what the painters and dockers used to be like.
I don't think they'll be making any underbelly series for the current version of the unions. I don't think they quite register like they did in the 60s, 70s and 80s.
No. So when we talk about all the different crimes that the dockers were involved in, one of Ray's first jobs with them was something that would later be called ghosting. So he would basically, this is back when you'd go to work, you'd punch your time card in, you'd punch out when you were done, and that was how many hours you'd work for the day. So his job was to go in, punch in multiple time cards, punch out multiple time cards at the end of the day, and there was someone collecting all of these paychecks for hours never really worked. It's a pretty easy con, but it worked, and they said for many years at any given point there was close to double the amount of paychecks being drawn than there were actual men working. For the guys at the top, this was deemed to be an easy way to make money because they would spread it out amongst anyone close to them. It was free cash. It was easy money.
Mm-hmm.
The painters and dockers, I guess the best way to look at it, it was Ray Bennett's apprenticeship into crime.
Right.
So like any other job, the painters and dockers offered for the right employees the chance to grow within the organization. You know, you came in, you did your time, you started out doing the basic level jobs like ghosting, and you would work your way up.
Sounds like a proper organization.
Yeah. And the thing with Ray is he found a way to quickly fast track his apprenticeship, and he began taking on more important work. So his time on the docks would expose him to some of Melbourne's most notorious criminals, and he was keen to quickly develop his skill set, build his contact list, and equipped himself, I suppose, for a life in crime. It was apparently well known that by the time he was 17, he was carrying a gun, and he was the type of guy that would have no issue using it, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Like I said,
especially today too. I don't know many 17-year-olds walking around with guns.
No, and I think if you look at today versus, during the 60s and the 70s, people grew up a lot quicker.
You had to. So he's entered the adult world at 13, 14, and he's been exposed to nothing but crime. I guess with anything, the closest people that surround you, you're gonna eventually start to mimic them and behave in the same type of fashion. So for me, thinking of a 17-year-old having a gun and not having any issue using it, that's crazy. Yeah, because you're not hearing about shootouts with 17-year-olds all the time, are you? Especially now.
So by the time he's 19, he's already on the police's radar, obviously. He's got a number of convictions under his belt at this point for stealing, for home break-ins. And as he starts to mature, I suppose, so do his crimes, going from the everyday house break-in to more sophisticated safe crackings and major thefts.
So you could say that this is a perfect example of the justice system and the penal system not working. As you said, he's got a number of convictions under his belt, yet the best is yet to come.
Pretty much. I mean, by the time he's 19, like I said, the cops already know who he is. And you could, I don't know, this is all speculation, but I think as it goes with the painters and dockers, the police, what's the nice way of saying it, could be bought?
Yeah. I think there was a scene in the second series of Underbelly where the joke was, would you like a ham sandwich? And the ham sandwich was a brown lunch paper bag full of cash.
Right, so I don't know that they would necessarily turn a complete blind eye on, go and do whatever you want, commit whatever type of crimes you want. But from what I could understand, Ray had done a good job of aligning himself with some of the higher up guys, so they probably didn't want their quickly growing junior to end up in jail.
No, exactly right.
So at 20, he meets who would become his wife. Her name was Gail Petrie. She was 17 at the time. And I think this was an opportunity for Ray. This could have been a turning point in his life, and he had the chance, the cliched fork in the road. I can either settle down, become a family man, get a real job, or do exactly what he went and did, and that was double down. And at the end of the day, I think for him, he was always a criminal first. That was front of mind for him. Everything else was just everything else. Like most well-known people, Ray had one goal, and that was to be the best. He wanted to be known as the man who could do what others said couldn't be done, and he wanted to be known as a criminal mastermind, which is interesting to me because we talk about it a lot, the likes of Elon Musk Steve Jobs. I'm not saying that they're in the same league at all, but it's funny how he used this determination that he had, because he wanted to be the best. He wanted to be the smartest criminal. He wanted to be known as the guy that could do things that other criminals couldn't do. It's hard not to think that if he had have used that determination to go off and do something else, what could have been for the guy.
Mm-hmm.
So to be the best, I suppose, you've got to be prepared to do what others won't. And like I said, Ray was well known to be a fearless criminal. He wasn't afraid to point a gun. He definitely wasn't afraid to kill. And one thing that he was famous for, he was not afraid of the police at all. Something that I would consider a potent mix for a criminal.
Absolutely.
Senior Detective Brian Murphy, who's now retired, he was what everyone calls one of the toughest cops of his generation. Because I suppose we talk about criminals being different back then, but I think the police were also different back then. They could probably get away with a little bit more than what the police can get away with today. And even he was known to say that Ray was the only criminal that he ever really feared.
That's a worry.
He's most probably the only bloke I've ever worried about. In his own way, he was the mastermind criminal. He was frightened of nothing. He knew more than the old blokes that had schooled him. And as far as he was concerned, he was number one.
But they would go on to become enemies, both well known to one another, multiple run-ins with one another.
It's hilarious, and I think I've mentioned this point on podcasts before. The police know who the criminals are, yet they can't do anything. It's amazing.
I don't want to pump up being a criminal, and I don't want to say, it takes intelligence to be a criminal, but I suppose to have a life in crime and to get away with it and to make a living out of it, because that's what a lot of these guys do. And there's still plenty of those criminals in today's day and age where they don't have real jobs. They don't go to an office and wear a suit and tie. Their livelihood comes from crime.
Yep.
Even though the cops might know who you are, I suppose it all comes down to what you can prove.
That's true.
So Ray was really the guy that you did not want to receive a threat from, because it would almost always be followed through on. And like most criminals, he worked to keep his private and his professional life separate. His wife, Gail, as you can imagine, spent majority of her time worrying. And while he never spoke about it, she knew, as did most, his growing reputation within the painters and dockers and what his growing standing in the criminal underworld was. And the reason I say that is because it came as a relief to her when Ray would suggest he's planning on moving overseas to England. She figured it was an opportunity to maybe get away from a life of crime. I think without knowing either of these two people, I'm just imagining if you're in a relationship with someone who is a criminal mastermind and an extremely well-known criminal, you're probably forever waiting for that day that he comes home or she comes home and says, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to get a real job. Yeah?
Yeah, I'd imagine so.
Unfortunately for her, that wasn't the case. So Ray's motives for moving overseas, again, leans back on his desire to be the best. So put aside the fact that there was starting to be some issues in the painters and dockers that probably would be best avoided if could. He also knew that going over to England would give him the opportunity to develop his skill set even more so and start to really hone his skills. He ends up in England with a group of Aussie expats that are living over there, known as the Kangaroo Gang.
Oh, what a great name.
Yeah. And they're a really well-known group of guys who will basically rob anyone. Not private homes. They were known more for shoplifting high-end stores.
Right.
Picturing the time back in the 60s and the 70s, you had these big payroll officers that would manage payrolls for companies and dole out the checks or the cash or whatever it may be. So a lot of those places would get knocked over by the Kangaroo Gang. And it was, I guess that was, like I said, part of Ray's desire to grow and develop his criminal skill set because he wanted to be the best. That was all that was on his mind, being the best criminal that he could be. And it was, well documented that he considered shoplifting and anything equivalent to that totally beneath his skill set. He tagged along with the Kangaroo Gang during the early 70s, and it was after being arrested on one of these payroll jobs, and he would do a small stint of time in an English prison. Again, we talk about the fact that he's a smart guy. He's trying to use his time productively. So instead of just wallowing away in prison, he decides this is the perfect break he needs from everything to start planning out the perfect heist. We obviously know what the heist is. We're talking about the Great Bookie Heist, and it's not something that he's just pulled out of thin air. So from all accounts, this has been one of those untouchable jobs back in Melbourne that every criminal has thought about doing once upon a time, but no one believed could ever be possible. And the big reason is because all these bookies are connected. I mean, it's probably not a stretch to say if you're a bookie in the 60s and the 70s, you're probably pretty close to the criminals in that area.
I'd say you've got some contacts with, if you're not in direct contact with, you've got some contacts with bookie people. Absolutely. Sorry, with criminal people.
Yeah,
absolutely.
They're not knocking over an office of accountants here.
No.
So everyone's spoken about this. Everyone's wanted to do it because it's known to be a massive cash grab. If you could ever work out a way to do it, tons of cash at any given point. So once he arrives back in Australia, this is now the mid-70s, he gets back into work pretty much straight away. He's had his break, he's done his time in England, he's been to prison, he's got this plan that's kind of starting to consume him.
He's getting his 10,000 hours up.
Exactly. He's getting his time, he's doing his time, he's making sure that when it comes to do the job, all his ducks are in line pretty much.
Yep.
So once he's back in Australia, like I said, him and Brian Murphy, or Senior Detective Brian Murphy, did become very quickly enemies of one another, and it wasn't long until their paths would cross again. So there was a theft of a leather goods store that Senior Detective Brian Murphy was working. He said it was almost obvious that Ray Bennett was involved. So one of the first things they did in the investigation was end up at Ray Chuck's house to have a discussion with him. Two sides of every story, but Brian Murphy says when he got there, he met with Gail, Ray's wife, and it was nothing but pleasant. He said that she was more than welcoming. I suppose she wanted to give the chance for Ray to be proven innocent, and we got nothing to hide. Everything's great. No problem, come on in. At this point, Ray and Gail had a young son who would have only been maybe 6 to 12 months old. Senior Detective Brian Murphy picked up the baby, passed the baby to Gail. That's his side of the story. Ray Bennett says that what he saw was Brian Murphy pick up the baby, throw him across the room.
Okay.
So
I know who I'm believing.
Well, for Ray, it was pretty easy. Kill Brian Murphy.
Yeah.
So Ray confronted Murphy along with some other officers after work while they ate dinner.
That Friday night, myself and several other detectives went over to have a pizza at West Melbourne. We were met by Bennett and another friend of his, and Bennett opened the conversation, and he's still throwing little babies across bedrooms. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, you fucking do know what I'm talking about. I said, well, if you think that, you can get fucked, because I haven't done it. One word led to another, and he and his mate took off. I got my mate to work with me to go back to Russell Street and get our guns, because I knew that one way or another something was going to happen.
Murphy's instincts were right. A few minutes later, Ray returned with a sawn-off shotgun, and it ended in a standoff, but 2 days later, Ray was in the police headquarters, and he would repeat his threat again to Murphy.
When I was going through the interview, he said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, at my time, the time of my making, in the place where I want to, I'm going to blow your fucking head off. You're nothing but a cunt, and that's it. I said, well, fair enough. I said, start it now. He said, no, it'll be when I'm fucking ready.
So fortunately for Senior Detective Brian Murphy, Ray would never actually get the chance to follow through on his threat to kill him. So a few years later, in 1975, the time was just right. Ray had his plan. Now all he needed was the crew. And he put together, as you can imagine, who's who of Melbourne criminals. You've got a guy like Ray Chuck Bennett, criminal mastermind. He's not getting around with just any random crim. He needs what he would consider to be the best of the best. So these guys, Ian Carroll, Lawrence Pendergast, Norman Chops Lee, Ian McNamara, and Vinnie Mickelson. Everybody says that individually these guys were extremely good at what they did. Ray had his vision, the perfect heist. He believed he had the leadership, he had the plan. He knew that if he combined everything that these guys had to offer, they would easily go on to achieve greatness. As far as robberies go, that's exactly what they did. They went on to achieve greatness. I should note here, though, there's multiple versions of this story, and there's a lot of speculation that 2 of the 3 Kane brothers were involved in the robbery.
Mm-hmm.
From everything that I can tell after looking at everything that's available, it doesn't look like that's the actual case. They definitely show up later on expecting part of the cash, but I'm quite certain that they weren't actually involved in the heist.
Right.
So part of Ray's plan was to have his team trained up. Like I mentioned, he was well known to meticulously plan his robberies and make sure that the people he employed were ready to do the jobs that he was going to give to them. So all the small details, all the big details, everything was covered off by Ray. He had the vision. He would set his team up to get stamina training, fitness training. He'd run them through drills for months leading up to the heist. Firearms training. While it's foreign for you and I to think of training for a robbery, this, like I said before, this was literally their job. This was their livelihood. And the intention, as always, was to be the absolute best in the business.
Sounds like they've got a better training program than a lot of employers that I've worked with over the last 10 to 15 years in terms of onboarding and getting ready to do the job properly.
You could quite easily argue that, but I guess like any organisation, it comes from leadership, doesn't it? Ray didn't want a group of people doing a half-assed job.
No.
He wanted his crew to be the best in the business, and he was prepared to give them all the tools that they needed. Training, guns, plans, all that type of gear. Whatever they needed to do the job, he was going to provide to them.
Some of the men involved in the Bookie robbery were some of the most willing and most probably some of the most intelligent people that have been known as criminals in the state of Victoria.
So anyways, the job's on. Wednesday, April 21st, 1976. A man dressed as a tradesman enters the Victoria Club in Melbourne. Now, for those unfamiliar, the Victoria Club was where all the bookmakers would go after a race to settle up. So there was always a ton of cash there. But today was slightly different. And from everything I've told you about Ray Chuck Bennett up to this point, I think you would know that he's not going to knock over the Victoria Club on just any day.
That's right.
He's waiting for the day that he knows the bookies have the most amount of cash. So Wednesday, the 21st, was just a couple of days after the Easter races, and he knew that that was probably as good as it gets. So the tradesman's in the club. He starts asking everyone which fridge needs to be fixed, and no one really knows what he's talking about. This is a room full of bookies that are, they're all excited about all this cash that they've got. So one of the guys shows him out the back, and it's a commercial kitchen. There's a bunch of fridges. He says, hey, listen, it must be one of these ones. And he kind of totally forgot about this tradesman who's there to fix the fridge. Obviously, the tradesman is part of Ray's crew. He quickly unlocks the back door and he lets the whole team in.
So some great security.
It's that
oh
easy.
My God.
Fix a fridge, we're in. So now all of them are in. Balaclavas, overalls, guns. They've got 118 bags with them ready to knock the place over. And within 11 minutes, that's exactly what they did. Within 11 minutes, they've completely turned the place over. No one injured, no one killed, but the bookies are now $15 million lighter than what they had been.
Wow.
This is the point in the story that I'd like to tell you, though. This is still technically an unsolved crime.
What do you mean by technically?
Well, no one's ever been convicted for the Great Bookie Heist. There's little speculation around exactly what happened next, though, and the reason is no one's ever really been put on trial and said, this is what happened, you're going to jail for it. So there's two versions. The first version says they took all that money, they fleed out the front door, they loaded it up in a van, and they were off, all said and done. I'm more inclined to believe that the second version of the story is the real version, just knowing everything I know about Ray Chuck Bennett.
Yep.
The second version of the story goes that part of the preparation for the heist was Ray had rented office space 2 floors above the Victoria Club. And the story goes that he and the 5 other guys would take this bag, all these bags of cash that they had, take them upstairs to their office, get undressed, get changed, and head off. No one was the wiser. The money was up there on top of the Victoria Club for at least 3 days before they would come back and get all that cash and move it.
It's strange to me, though, because I've worked in jobs where an armour guard truck comes and picks up daily takings or weekly takings from a retail store, which wouldn't be anywhere near $15 million. Again, my question would be, where's the security? None, obviously.
Yeah, I guess not a ton of it. And I don't know the ins and outs of how all of this worked. But from what I can gather, the bookies didn't ever really want anyone to know how much cash they had.
Yeah, but it doesn't take a... Well, if Ray Chuck can work it out, then geez.
Well, this is the thing. By all the news reports, the bandits got away with just a little over $1 million.
Right.
But everyone knew that the bookies only said that so that they could avoid having to pay tax on the actual amount.
Smart.
So, as the story would develop, the speculation was it was somewhere between $4 and $10 million. But now, looking back from 2020, in reality, it was just over $15 million. I should say, I hear $15 million today. I think that's a lot of money, but this was in 1976. So, for reference, that's the equivalent of just shy of $70 million today.
It's a big heist.
It's a big heist. Well, it is Australia's biggest ever cash heist. And I'd also like to put into context, in Australia, or in Melbourne specifically, in the mid-70s, the average annual salary was around $7,500. And you could purchase a house, again, average house price in Melbourne, was about $33,000 in the mid-70s.
Yeah, so if you've got $15 million, you're swimming.
Right. So tons of speculation around how they did it, how they got away with it, and how much they stole. I think it's all pretty apparent now, though. I think they took it upstairs. I think that makes sense, knowing what I know about Ray Bennett. He's not going to risk running out into the street with $15 million worth of cash.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you decide to believe on the story-wise, it's a known fact that it was Ray Chuck Bennett who pulled the great Bookie Heist off.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a pretty interesting story, but it's what follows that's probably the most interesting. So like I said, no one has been convicted of the great Bookie Heist, still up till today.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the crew, Chops, or Norman Lee, he was arrested and he was charged. He was the only man to be charged. He was found with $40,000 in cash that was able to be traced back to the Bookie Heist, but he was later acquitted of all charges. So still, no convictions.
How was he acquitted? No evidence, I guess.
Not enough evidence. He had the cash, but what does that prove?
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't prove that he was the guy there with the gun yelling, "Get down, put your head down,"
Exactly.
I mean, I can't account for where my cash comes from. That sounds wrong.
I definitely can't account for where all my cash comes from or where it all goes either.
I can account where my income comes from. I can't account for where the physical cash comes from. I don't know the history of every individual note.
We're leaving this in. We're definitely leaving this in.
So Ray set out to achieve the greatest heist in Australian history. He is at this point a criminal mastermind. There was one thing though that he could not have known. During the entire heist, only 2 of the armed men spoke. So there's 6 guys in this crew filling up bags of cash. Ray's the leader. He was the first one in. After the tradesman. He was the one who instructed everyone to get on the floor. He was the one that explained, "We're here, we're robbing the place. Don't move," type of thing. One of the other crew though, Tony McNamara, maybe it was instinct, maybe it was a reflex, but for whatever reason, he told everyone to put their heads down and don't look at him.
That sounds like a gap in the training, to be honest.
So, one thing I don't think any of them were prepared for, especially not Tony, otherwise he probably wouldn't have said anything, but one of his old acquaintances was in the room. He was a bookie named Ambrose Palmer. And like I said, I think the bookies, it's pretty clear that the bookies have, a little bit of a loose connection with the criminals. So I think the criminal code carries over. And Ambrose never spoke to the police. He never said, "I know who did it. It was these guys." But he would tell someone probably a lot worse than the police knowing, and that was the Kane brothers. So I mentioned earlier that there was some speculation around the Kanes being involved. When Ambrose told the Kanes what had happened and who had done it, that would essentially set off a huge chain reaction.
Philip Dunn QC successfully defended the only man ever charged over the great bookie robbery, Norman "Normie" Lee. After Lee was acquitted, he told his barrister details of the elaborate robbery.
And their troubles only began once the robbery was finished, because then a gang of criminals from Sydney, the toe cutters, came down and were after them, and not just their toes.
You had people like the toe cutters in Sydney were snooping around, and this is what's alleged about Brian Kane and his brother. They were trying to put pressure on the Western Suburbs villains and get a part of the action. Well, they were told to go fuck themselves. And this is how the Brian Kane and Les Kane episodes evolved after that.
So Brian and Les Kane, also painters and dockers, were known to be some of the most vicious criminals in Melbourne. And I think it makes sense when I tell you how they would make a living. Majority of their income came from standing over other criminals.
Yep.
So they were the type of guys that they'd hear of a job, they'd go and put their hand out and say, we know you just did the such and such job, where's our cut? And that's how they made their money.
It's quite common in the criminal world, like drug dealing and any type of, organised crime, is that, if you run an area where you believe, that's your area, and someone wants to, do something within your area, it's almost like a tax.
Yeah, well, it is. Yeah. I mean, and from all accounts, these guys, like I said, were total psychopaths. So I don't think, if you just knocked over $100 and they wanted $20, you're probably safer just paying them the $20 and avoid having your legs broken or being stabbed.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, Ambrose, the bookie, he told the Kane brothers, probably hoping for a kickback of his own.
Mm-hmm.
Once it became known to them who was responsible for the bookie heist, they did exactly what they always do. They went and said, where's our cut? Ray, being the type of person he was, criminal mastermind, he's done all the preparation. He's put his guys through months of training.
Mm-hmm.
He's made sure his guys are physically fit. He's trained them up in how to use guns. He's devised his plan. He had no intentions of sharing the haul with the Kane brothers or with anybody. Error in judgment here for Ray, because he would take a preemptive strike against the Kane brothers. This was in October of 1978, so a couple of years after the heist. Ray and two of the other guys from the original crew, Pendergast and Mickelson, waited for Les Kane and his family to come home one night. Literally waiting in the driveway, they ambushed him into the house. They took Les into the living room, left his wife and 2 kids standing in the kitchen. Point blank, they shoot Les in the face.
Jesus.
In front of the wife and the 2 young kids, they drag Les's body through the house. They put him into the boot of his car. And like I said, the Kane brothers were extremely well known. And one of the things that Les was particularly known for was he drove a hot pink Ford. They put Les into the boot of his hot pink Ford. They drive off. Les and his car never found.
Right.
That's still, as of today, 2020, never found.
Not hard to chop up a car.
No, but you know, I suppose with these high-profile murders, it's just crazy to think that this was 35 years ago. No, 45 years ago, never found. By now, Ray's gone into hiding. On one hand, he's gotten away with the perfect crime. He didn't. But now he's dealing with the fallout of murdering Les, trying to keep his family safe. He makes no contact with them. He makes no contact with his old crew. He keeps clear of home, basically. You kind of say maybe it's not a good thing being a criminal, because, he got away with $15 million cash, but now he's holed up somewhere and he can't spend it. He can't do anything.
Yeah, I've changed my mind. I don't think I'm going to do it now.
No.
Yeah.
So while the cops had nothing to pin on Ray or any of the guys for the robbery, Ray, Chuck, Pendergast and Mickelson were all charged with the murder of Les Kane in November of 1978. And while they were all acquitted at trial...
What?
Again, no evidence.
Eyewitnesses?
No body, no murder weapon, no proof.
Eyewitnesses?
You got his wife, you've got his 2 young kids, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. My husband's gone. What, you really?
There's no proof.
What do you mean? There's an eyewitness, and now my husband's gone. How is that not proof enough?
But mate, what if I call the cops now and I say, I saw Jason do this, I saw it happen? Do you want to end up in jail even if they can't? But they can't prove it. They've got no proof.
I don't know, man. It just seems a bit much.
But that's how it all works. You've got to be able to prove it. A witness is only good when it substantiates the facts.
I think the burden of proof is too harsh. I think we need to lower the burden of proof to get some of these, miscreants off the streets.
I'm not defending them, but imagine the state of it all if you could just say someone did something.
Yeah, we'd have less criminals on the streets.
You'd have less people on the streets.
Nah,
every time someone looked at me wrong, I'd just say, they killed someone.
I don't think that would happen. I think you're thinking the worst of people.
Well, you need to be able to prove it, and that's why I made the point of the fact that his body and his car were never found. There's no proof.
Right.
So Pendergast and Mickelson at this point quickly get out. They go into hiding. They know it's all about to hit the fan here because everyone already had their suspicions that Ray and his gang did the murder of Les, but now it's basically the spotlight's been put on it at this point. So Ray, unfortunately for him, he had some unanswered charges for armed robbery of a payroll office, which meant as soon as he was acquitted for Les's murder, he was taken straight back into custody. And guess where he ended up?
I'm going to say he ended up somewhere pretty famous with someone pretty famous.
He ended up in... he did. He ended up in H Division with Chopper Reed.
H Division. You can't see me now, but I'm doing the thing that Jimmy Luffman did on his wrist when they caught up later on and he goes, H Division. He puts like the fingers on his wrist. Yeah, H Division. Crazy.
Yeah, he was in H Division and the Kanes had all their people down there plotting and planning to stick knives at him in H Division. And that's why he was pleased that I went in the yard with him. Because I went in the yard with him, you're as sweet as a bun. I ran H Division. Let's not beat around the bush. I ran H Division. For 10.5 years I ran the place.
So figuring that he'd be safer in jail than out on the street, knowing that Brian Kane would be out for revenge, I guess he figured he had a little bit of time to work out what's next. The one thing he didn't plan on was an attack whilst he was back at the courthouse.
Probably not.
Raymond Patrick Bennett was gunned down in the corridors of the courthouse as he was being led to the 10th court to face armed robbery charges. The killer stood at the top of a flight of stairs and fired 3 shots, hitting Bennett twice in the chest and in one of his hands. As the killer calmly turned and went down the back stairs of the court, Bennett reeled backwards and ran into a courtyard where he collapsed in a pool of blood. The police officers escorting him, after being warned by the killer not to follow, chased Bennett, believing he was trying to escape.
So due to their long-lasting feud, old mate Senior Detective Brian Murphy was actually at the top of the list of suspects for his murder.
Really?
Yep.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
The previous Sunday, I'd been to Carlton with my wife and one of my daughters for the Italian festival. And we were about to go into La Holba, which was a cafe up there. And a bloke come out and put his head down and just kept going. And I said to my wife, I said, that's Brian Kane. I said, you're wearing the same cap as I've got. And which is, anybody could wear them, but he looked more like me. Now, later on, a photo fit was done by witnesses, and one of them was sent to me with, I wonder who this is, much intimating that I was the bloke that shot Chuck in the court, and have a look at this. I did nothing about it, couldn't have cared less. I knew where I was and what I had done. But a lot of policemen most probably thought that I was behind it.
Nowadays, though, no one denies that the shooter was Brian Kane. He was there, he was dressed as a barrister, fake beard, waiting in the court. Yeah, whole 9 yards, waiting in the courthouse corridors. He'd publicly declared at this point Ray Chuck was a dead man. After killing his brother, I think no one doubted that Brian Kane was going to get his revenge. Brian Kane, along with many criminals, were obviously well connected on both sides of the law. And at this point, still it remains unproven. There was always speculation that Brian had the assistance from the police in the murder of Ray Chuck Bennett. Just like the great Bookie Heist, though, even though everyone knows that Brian did it, Ray's murder still technically remains unsolved today. He died at just 32.
The police department gave my squad the job of guarding the body down at the Undertaker's because they reckoned that the Kanes were going to again chop his hands and feet off and both him with his wife. And I was looking at him, I thought, well, what a waste of a life. Here you are, the age you are, and your wife and kids left behind. What was it all worth?
Thanks for listening to this week's story. We really appreciate when you take the time to subscribe, rate and review the podcast. If you've enjoyed the great Bookie Heist, we've got some great news. Next week, we've got our brand new podcast, Heists, launching. Season 1 debuts next Tuesday. We would really appreciate if you take the time to search on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify for Heists. Hit that subscribe button. The first 3 episodes will be out next Tuesday.
And now, folks, it's time to say
thanks again for dropping in. We hope you'll make this a weekly visit. Bring the family. Hope you enjoy the evening as much as we've enjoyed having you here.
Carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
Good night now.